history often hides its darkest truths in plain sight. We hear of empires rising and falling, but rarely do we pause to ask what happened to the people who stood in their way. The rapid expansion of the early Islamic world is usually described in glowing terms, a flourishing of science, culture, and learning. But beneath that glittering surface lay something far more unsettling. What if the real story isn't about enlightened rule, but about conquest engineered to erase entire civilizations? When the first Islamic Caliphates emerged in the 7th century, they didn't merely aim to control territory, they sought to reshape the world itself. At a time when the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were weakened by decades of war and internal divisions, Islamic armies moved swiftly across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Their military victories were remarkable, but what made these conquests truly transformative was something far deeper than battlefield strategy. The Caliphates understood that the fastest way to secure long-term domination was to break the spirit of the societies they conquered. Unlike many earlier conquerors, they didn't simply take land and levy tribute. They implemented a mechanism of control that targeted culture, religion, and identity. Wherever Islamic forces advanced, their goal was to make resistance not just militarily, but psychologically impossible. Arab chroniclers of the period describe conquest not merely as expansion, but as a purifying mission. This meant entire cities could be spared if they submitted, but annihilated if they resisted. Requests to surrender were often accompanied by clear warnings: convert freely, now, or pay a heavy tax for the right to stay in your faith, and watch your sacred places fall brick by brick if you refuse. The early caliphates mastered the use of fear as a political tool. One of the most effective methods was the public destruction of religious and cultural icons. When Alexandria fell, its libraries, the remnants of the greatest knowledge center of antiquity, were intentionally burned. This wasn't collateral damage, it was a signal, a declaration that the old world was dead and a new order had arrived. Similar policies were enacted in Egypt, Persia, and parts of Syria. Temples and monasteries that had stood through centuries of invasion were deliberately demolished or converted into mosques. The psychological effect was massive if even the gods of the conquered people could not protect their own homes, who could economic policy became another weapon of control. The new rulers imposed the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims that was not simply financial, but humiliating by design. Those who paid were publicly struck or forced to kneel. Refusal meant imprisonment, execution, or displacement. Over time, those policies stripped communities of their wealth and dignity, making conversion not just a religious decision, but a matter of survival. While many Western histories compare Islamic expansion to medieval European conquests in practice, the Islamic system was far more systematic. Medieval European warfare was undeniably brutal, but it rarely sought to erase the culture or faith of the defeated. In contrast, the Islamic Caliphates drafted long-term plans for the re-education of captured populations. They formed administrative structures that ensured Arabic would replace local languages, mosques would replace temples, and Islamic law would replace any previous system of justice. This wasn't solely driven by religious zeal. There was a cold logic to it. By destroying cultural and intellectual centers, they ensured future generations would grow up knowing no other worldview, and therefore no reason to resist. Even children were weaponized in this effort, taught to forget their past, and then used against their own people. It was a strategy that would reach its most terrifying form in the Ottoman Empire, but its roots began here in the very earliest days of Islamic expansion. From the outside, it might have looked like a grand civilizational rise, but for the millions caught beneath it, it was the beginning of a long, carefully planned unraveling of their identity. The Ottoman Empire perfected what earlier caliphates had only begun: the systematic use of children as tools of conquest. At the heart of this system was the devshirme, or blood tax, one of the most feared and devastating policies in medieval Europe. For Christian families across the Balkans, the mere rumor of Ottoman officials approaching was enough to send villages into hiding or prayer. Because when the collectors arrived, they came not for money, but for sons. Every few years, imperial agents swept through rural regions, selecting boys between the ages of 8 and 18. Age didn't matter as much as physical strength and intelligence. The Ottomans wanted the best. Parents were forced to stand helplessly as their children were taken away, knowing they would likely never see them again. Refusal wasn't an option. Resistance meant death for the entire family, and often brutal public executions to discourage others from attempting the same. These boys were marched to Istanbul, forcibly converted to Islam, and stripped of everything that tied them to their former lives. They were given new names and forbidden to speak their native languages. Even accidental use of their mother tongue resulted in beatings or solitary confinement. The goal was simple: and chilling erase their past and then rebuild them into loyal servants of the empire. The most promising among them were trained as janissaries, an elite military corps that became one of the most feared forces in Europe. Their training was as psychological as it was physical. Instructors told them their Christian families had abandoned them. The Sultan, they were told, had saved them from ignorance and brought them into the light of the one true faith. Food, clothing, and praise were used strategically, not as kindness, but as tools to redirect loyalty. Eventually, many of these boys believed it. Some even wrote letters thanking the empire for rescuing them. The tragedy wasn't simply that children were stolen, it was that they were transformed into weapons used against their own people. Former Christians, now janissaries, led raids on Christian villages. Historians describe battles where local defenders recognized familiar faces in the invading ranks, neighbors, cousins, even brothers, who had been taken years earlier. The Ottomans knew exactly what they were doing. Turning sons into soldiers wasn't just efficient. It sent a message: we own your future. The scale of this practice is almost unimaginable by modern standards. Between the mid-14th and early 19th centuries, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were taken. In some regions, entire generations grew up believing at any moment someone might knock on the door and take their children away. Families adopted desperate measures. Some scarred their sons' faces, hoping visible injuries would make them less desirable to Ottoman officers. Others hid boys in forests or caves when rumors of a collection circulated. In remote mountain areas, oral traditions developed around secret hiding spots and coded songs used to signal danger. And yet the Ottoman system evolved to hunt them down. Informants were rewarded. Local collaborators were appointed to identify eligible boys. Even priests were sometimes coerced into handing over names under threat of torture or destruction of their churches. In many Western accounts, the janissaries are portrayed simply as elite warriors in ornate uniforms. But rarely do we hear what they truly represented: a generation of children reprogrammed into believing their own heritage was the enemy. It was psychological warfare on a generational scale, and for many Balkan communities, it marked the beginning of cultural trauma that continues to echo even today. While the devshirme devastated Christian communities in Europe, another system unfolded across Africa and the Middle East, a sprawling economic enterprise that lasted over 1,000 years and reshaped entire continents. The Islamic slave trade began in the 7th century and continued unbroken into the early 20th century, persisting far longer than the Atlantic slave trade and generating human suffering on a scale almost impossible to measure. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which relied heavily on agricultural labor, the Islamic slave system was driven by a broad array of uses: domestic work, military service construction, concubinage, and eunuch administration. Arab chroniclers such as al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta casually described slave markets as if they were describing a common bazaar for textiles or spices. The tone was never shocked; it was normalized, integrated deeply into social and religious structures. But one aspect stands out for its sheer brutality: systematic castration. Historical estimates suggest that between 80 and 90% of male slaves destined for Islamic markets were castrated either before being transported or upon arrival. The procedure was crude and incredibly dangerous. Carried out in makeshift centers, the most infamous being in Aswan, Egypt, the mortality rate was staggering. For every 10 boys taken in, 9 died. Those who survived became eunuchs, stripped of the ability to have families, and forever marked as lesser human beings. In a cruel twist of logic, this practice aligned with religious law. Islamic jurists encouraged manumission, freeing of slaves, particularly if a slave converted to Islam. Castration served a convenient purpose. It prevented enslaved populations from growing naturally, ensuring a permanent demand for new captives while avoiding the complications of large hereditary slave communities. Female slaves were subjected to a different kind of violence. The most beautiful were purchased for harems or sold as concubines. Written accounts describe women brought from Nubia, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and even as far as India, grouped, displayed, and inspected as if they were livestock. Prices for a particularly attractive young woman could exceed the annual income of a skilled artisan. Those not chosen for harems were used in domestic labor or agricultural work, often in scorching climates far from their homelands. The impact on the source regions was immense. Across sub-Saharan Africa, entire communities were destabilized by slave raids. Villages disappeared, not just physically but socially. Generations of men were removed, leaving behind imbalanced populations and broken family structures. Economic development stalled in regions constantly under threat of raids. Stability, trade, and learning became impossible in places where no one felt safe planting crops or raising children. In the Caucasus, families lived with the constant anxiety that boys might be captured and sold eastward. Folk tales from Georgia, Armenia, and Circassia still tell of children whisked away in the night, legends that are in many cases rooted in historical fact. Even after conversion, freedom was never guaranteed. Some slaves converted in hopes of better treatment, but many masters simply ignored the obligation to free Muslim slaves. And because the Islamic slave markets remained open and profitable, there was little incentive to reduce demand. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, where descendants of the enslaved created distinct cultural identities, in the Americas, the Islamic system left very few enduring communities. That wasn't accidental. The policies were designed to prevent it. Slaves who survived could not form families or pass down traditions. Their identities, religious, cultural, and social, were deliberately erased. This wasn't simply forced labor. It was a broad-scale dismantling of human continuity. The slave markets of Cairo and Baghdad may no longer exist, but the demographic scars across Africa and the Middle East remain. In many regions, population declines and lost lineages are still evident in historical census records and oral histories. What makes this even more haunting is how ordinary it all seemed to contemporaries. Chroniclers wrote about it with the same tone they used for describing grain prices or weather. In their eyes, this was simply how the world worked. As the Islamic empires expanded, conquest didn't end once the opponent's armies were defeated. In many ways, that's where the real struggle began, a slow, intentional dismantling of belief systems that had sustained civilizations for centuries. Subjugated peoples were given a choice: that wasn't a choice at all: convert, pay, or perish. The jizya, a tax imposed on non-Muslims, was initially framed as a form of protection, but in practice it became an economic weapon. In many regions, the tax represented several months of income and had to be paid publicly. Men were forced to kneel or bow before tax collectors, sometimes being slapped as a symbolic reminder of their inferior status. These weren't isolated incidents. The humiliation was baked into policy designed to pressure people into conversion, not by the sword, but by despair. Legal restrictions reinforced that pressure. In Egypt, Christians were forbidden from repairing existing churches, let alone building new ones. In Persia, Zoroastrians couldn't testify in court against a Muslim-owned certain kinds of property, or ride horses, a privilege reserved for Muslims. Jewish and Christian processions were banned. Even ringing church bells was considered an act of defiance. Religious buildings were not simply taken, they were strategically defaced. When Arabs conquered Coptic Egypt in 641 AD, they began a long campaign of destruction against monasteries and libraries. These weren't just places of worship, they were intellectual hubs, holding centuries of accumulated knowledge. In India, Mahmud of Ghazni's campaigns between 1000 and 1027 AD resulted in the destruction of over 50,000 Hindu temples. His chroniclers wrote proudly about the temples reduced to rubble and the idols smashed and buried under mosque foundations. One of the most symbolic examples was the destruction of the Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites. Its stones were carted away and incorporated into the steps of a mosque, forcing worshippers to physically walk over the ruins of their own faith. The message was unmistakable: your gods are powerless, and your past is gone. Forced conversions often took place in the ruins of these destroyed temples. Victims were marched into the shattered remains and ordered to swear allegiance to Islam. For many, refusal meant execution on the spot. For others, especially the wealthy or influential, conversion bought temporary safety for themselves and their families. But that safety came with a price. They were now expected to turn on their own people and assist in further conversions. Throughout North Africa, Christianity, once vibrant and intellectually rich, withered under these pressures. Augustine of Hippo had written some of Christianity's most enduring works in what is now Algeria. Within a few centuries, those communities vanished completely. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests were hunted down, their fire temples extinguished after burning uninterrupted for over 1,000 years. Entire religious traditions older than Islam by millennia disappeared from daily life and survived only in small enclaves or distant diaspora. This wasn't accidental or the chaotic byproduct of war. It was policy. Islamic jurists developed elaborate rules and exemptions that made the practice of other religions exceedingly difficult, but stopped just short of outright bans. The goal was slow suffocation, a system that left people technically free to worship as they pleased, while ensuring that every aspect of life reminded them they no longer held power over their own destiny. By combining legal humiliation, economic pressure, and the destruction of sacred spaces, the caliphates created something more effective than forced conversion by the sword, a world in which people chose to abandon their faith because survival demanded it. And once a people willingly abandon what made them who they were, the rest, language, culture, identity, becomes far easier to erase. In the shadow of military conquest and forced conversion, another form of domination unfolded, quiet, intimate, and devastatingly effective. Across the Islamic world, the institution of the harem served not merely as a private pleasure sphere for rulers, but as a system of political control and cultural subjugation. At its core was the trafficking of women on a scale few empires had ever attempted. Female captives from Balkan villages, Caucasian mountain towns, North African caravans, and Indian cities were rounded up during military campaigns or purchased in slave markets. The most beautiful were transported directly to the palaces of sultans, emirs, and governors. There they were stripped of their names, histories, and native languages. Many were forced to memorize carefully constructed biographies designed to insert them into courtly lineage, a fabricated past replacing their real one. Historians often describe the Abbasid harem in Baghdad as a silken cage, but in reality it was far more brutal. These women had no legal rights whatsoever. They could be bought, sold, gifted, or discarded at the whim of whoever possessed them. Their children were considered legally inferior unless the father chose to legitimize them. Even then, a concubine's influence could evaporate the moment she aged or fell out of favor. Harun al-Rashid, glorified in the Arabian Nights as a wise and generous ruler, maintained a harem of over 2,000 women. At the fall of Baghdad in 1258, Mongol sources report that more than 700 women were found in the last Abbasid caliph's harem, many of whom were slaughtered alongside the royal family when the city burned. Their identities and stories vanished with them. Outside the palaces, an entire market infrastructure grew up around the trafficking of women for sexual purposes. Ibn Battuta describes walking through the slave markets of Cairo and seeing young women displayed naked for inspection, potential buyers testing their teeth skin and flexibility as if they were livestock. The most highly prized were often Circassian or Georgian, believed to possess a perfect combination of beauty and obedience. Prices could reach levels unimaginable for ordinary people, sometimes equivalent to the cost of an entire house. Families in source regions knew exactly what this meant. In parts of the Balkans, parents would scar their daughters' faces in their early teens, hoping the disfigurement would make them less attractive to Ottoman raiders. Others kept their daughters indoors for years, allowing them outside only at night. Some communities developed elaborate underground networks, smuggling girls across borders to areas where the Ottoman reach was weaker. But such strategies rarely worked in the long run. The demand for young women never decreased, and the empire's reach only grew. Unlike wives who retained status and protection, concubines were temporary by design. When they aged or became less desirable, they were often sold or assigned to lower-status men within the palace, effectively recycled until they were exhausted. This created a relentless need for replacement and turned sexual slavery into a self-perpetuating industry. Religious scholars provided a legal framework to justify all of this, citing Quranic verses about those whom your right hands possess. Elaborate treatises were written to explain precisely how a slave could be purchased, used, and discarded while still remaining within the bounds of divine law. In practice, this meant that the widespread sexual exploitation of captured women wasn't an abuse of the system. It was the system. For the conquered communities, the damage was incalculable. The systematic removal of young women disrupted family formation, destroyed traditional marriage patterns, and severed the lineage lines that pass on culture and memory. In many regions, entire generations of young women disappeared. Even where people survived the legacy of fear, endured long after the raids stopped, families continued to hide daughters and restrict their movements, habits that in some places became entrenched cultural norms. This wasn't only about pleasure or even control. It was a calculated dismantling of the social fabric. By stealing a people's daughters and turning them into instruments of someone else's power, the conquerors didn't just break families, they erased futures. Military victory and religious domination were only two pillars of the caliphate's system of control. The third was economic, and in many ways it was the most enduring. Islamic rulers developed strategies not simply to extract wealth, but to permanently cripple the economies of conquered peoples, ensuring they could never again build the capacity to resist. One of the most effective tools was the kharaj, or land tax. Unlike the jizya, which targeted non-Muslim individuals, the kharaj applied directly to agricultural lands and could consume between 50% and 80% of annual production. Farmers in Syria, North Africa, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent found themselves working twice as hard, only to hand over most of their harvest to regional governors. Families that had cultivated the same land for generations suddenly faced the threat of losing it all if a single bad harvest left them unable to pay. And when they couldn't pay, the consequences were immediate. Land was confiscated and transferred to Muslim settlers or reclassified as waqf, religious endowment property, permanently removing it from the original owners and placing it under Islamic institutional control. In practical terms, this meant that the wealth produced by the land now flowed into mosques, madrasas, or the personal coffers of ruling elites. The destruction wasn't always overt. In Persia, the sophisticated irrigation systems of the Sasanian Empire systems that had turned arid land into fertile fields were allowed to fall into disrepair. Some canals were deliberately damaged during conquest and never rebuilt. Others were taxed so heavily that local communities couldn't afford even basic maintenance. What had been a thriving agricultural heartland gradually deteriorated into marginal land suitable only for subsistence farming. Tribute systems further compounded the damage. In Nubia, conquered peoples were required to deliver 400 slaves every year to the Fatimid Caliphate. The Bulgars were forced to provide young men for military service effectively, a state-sanctioned raid carried out annually. These quotas weren't just burdensome. They were designed to depopulate and destabilize. Trade restrictions created a form of economic apartheid. Non-Muslims in many regions were barred from certain professions, particularly those involving long-distance trade or high-value goods. Muslim merchants who were exempt from many taxes and enjoyed legal privileges increasingly dominated regional commerce. Over time, entire sectors of the economy were transferred into Muslim hands, while non-Muslim communities became impoverished and marginalized. The cumulative effect was devastating. Regions that had once been centers of culture and commerce, like Alexandria, Damascus, and Ctesiphon, saw their traditional economic networks dismantled. Formerly prosperous communities found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. For many families, conversion to Islam became not a matter of belief, but of survival. Converts gained access to lower taxes, better jobs, and security. In this way, economics became yet another weapon of conversion, one that worked slowly, but almost always successfully. In some accounts, modern scholars describe this as soft pressure, but for those who lived through it, there was nothing soft about watching crops fail and children starve because a ruler in a distant capital demanded tribute. Economic warfare achieved what armies and priests alone could not: the permanent restructuring of society to favor the conquerors at every level, social, cultural, and material. By the time resistance became impossible, the transformation was complete. The old systems of trade governance and agriculture had been replaced. What remained were populations too poor to rebel, too fragmented to organize, and too exhausted to remember what life had once been like before the conquerors came. By the time military conquest, religious subjugation, and economic domination had taken root, one final objective remained: the complete erasure of indigenous cultures. Unlike the sudden violence of war, this phase unfolded slowly through language policies, suppression of traditions, and the calculated destruction of memory itself. In territory after territory, Arabic was imposed as the official language of administration, education, and worship. Local languages, Coptic in Egypt, Pahlavi in Persia, Syriac in the Levant, were pushed out of public life. At first, bilingualism existed, but within a generation or two, younger people stopped learning the old languages altogether simply because they weren't useful anymore. Culture began to disappear in silence, not in flames. Educational institutions played a crucial role. Schools that had once taught philosophy, mathematics, and literature from rich local traditions were replaced by madrasas focused exclusively on Islamic theology and Arabic jurisprudence. In many places, this wasn't just a shift in curriculum, it was a blockade. Entire fields of knowledge were declared irrelevant or heretical. Books were burned not because they were dangerous, but because they were unnecessary in the new order. Celebrations and festivals were targeted next. The Persian New Year Nowruz, a millennia-old holiday that had survived empires and invasions, was banned outright in several regions. In conquered Indian territories, Hindu festivals were suppressed or rebranded with Islamic versions. The point wasn't merely to control crowds or avoid unrest, it was to break the cycle of cultural continuity. If a community can no longer gather publicly to celebrate its heritage, that heritage eventually fades from living memory. Monuments and sacred architecture were destroyed or altered. Zoroastrian fire temples were extinguished and repurposed. Hindu temples were demolished and their stones used in mosque construction. In Egypt, ancient Coptic churches were systematically razed or converted. Even geographical names were changed. Cities that had existed for thousands of years under one name were rechristened with Arabic ones. It wasn't convenience, it was deliberate historical erasure. If you change the name of a place, you change the story people tell about it. Perhaps the most haunting example is Egypt, the ancient civilization that had survived Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, finally disappeared not through outright slaughter, but through cultural absorption. Coptic, the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, slowly vanished from daily use. Today, it survives only as a liturgical language in a small Christian minority, a remnant of a civilization that once dominated the Nile Valley. In Persia, the legacy of Zoroastrianism now survives mostly in India and scattered diaspora communities not in the land where it was born. Archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of entire societies, libraries, schools, temples that were systematically destroyed and then forgotten. Excavations reveal cities with sudden breaks in cultural continuity, like a thread that was deliberately cut. These weren't isolated acts of vandalism or the chaotic destruction of war. They followed a consistent pattern across vastly different regions, suggesting a deliberate policy: remove the past to secure the future. Looking back, it's easy to admire the administrative efficiency and rapid expansion of the Islamic empires. But when we examine the lived experience of those who were conquered, a different picture emerges, one of identities, erased languages, silenced, and civilizations reduced to ruins beneath newer structures. The methods may have varied from region to region, but the goal remained constant: the complete domination not just of land or body, but of memory itself. History isn't just a record of victories and defeats. It's a mirror that reflects what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. The stories you've just heard aren't distant relics. They're reminders of how easily entire cultures can vanish when power is wielded without restraint. If this episode made you think, or if you learned something new today, consider supporting the channel by leaving a comment, subscribing, or sharing this video with someone else who loves hidden history. Your curiosity keeps these forgotten stories alive.